Episode 30, I Wanta Wampa, originally posted July 31, 2015. Sometime in the 80s, when I was about 7, I got the opportunity to go to the US with my family. Back then, the US was this magical place that my dad would occasionally fly off to and come back bringing wonderful gifts and bounties. So you can imagine how excited I was. I was finally going to see for myself this amazing place where most of my toys came from. I was finally going to see what heaven looked like. I will never forget the first time I walked into my first Toys R Us. I have to say it was definitely more memorable than Disneyland. For younger viewers out there, you have to understand, today's Toys R Us stores were nothing like the ones in the 80s. When you hear an 80s kid talk or boast about entire aisles of Transformers, G.I. Joes, and Star Wars toys, they weren't kidding. Okay, I'm sure there were also entire aisles of Barbies and ponies, but I never got that far. In today's toy store, action figures of a specific brand would probably take up around 2 or 3 pegs of shelf space. But back then, you would have a wall. Imagine it, a wall taller than you of action figure pegs. To say I was overwhelmed would be an understatement. I was blown away. Every single toy I had in mind was there. That and a whole lot more other stuff that I didn't even know existed. But despite this euphoric overload in my head, one particular toy did get my attention. He was lurking in the Star Wars aisle next to the action figure wall. God, I love that description. He wasn't quite what you would call an action figure, but he definitely wasn't a vehicle. He was the Hoth Wampa. For those of you not familiar, the Wampa was this creature. Think abominable snowman who lived on the planet Hoth. You know, the icy planet at the end of Empire Strikes Back where the rebel base was located. So before the epic battle on Hoth, the one with the snow speeders and the AT-ATs, our hero Luke Skywalker went out on a scouting mission, and while he was out there alone, he was attacked by some mysterious beast that knocked him off his tauntaun, those kangaroo-looking thingies that the rebels would ride like horses on Hoth, and dragged him off to his cave to eat. Moments later, Luke wakes up hanging upside down suspended on the roof of the cave. Using the Force, he regains his lightsaber, frees himself and escapes, but not before cleanly slicing off the Wampa's arm when he tries to stop him. Anyway, the entire sequence isn't very long, and because of all the snow, you hardly get a good look at what the Wampa actually looks like. I do believe, though, that in later versions of the movie, Lucas actually put in new scenes showing more of the Wampa. One interesting bit of info is that it's widely believed that the Wampa attack on Luke was inserted into the film to help explain some residual scarring that Luke Skywalker actor Mark Hamill had on his face. In 1977, between the filming of episodes 4 and 5, Hamill was involved in a serious car accident that left him in need of reconstructive face surgery. And what better way to explain Luke's altered facial features than to have him mauled by a giant alien snowman? So anyway, now that we know what a Wampa is, let's continue. So there he was on the shelf, big, white, and ugly, and I wanted him. But when my dad saw the price tag of $11, he just scoffed. Too expensive. Get something else, he said. Back then, a typical Joe or Star Wars action figure costs around $2, so you could imagine $11 for something that wasn't the size of a playset or a vehicle was a big deal. So that was that. No Wampa. Or so my dad thought. As the days passed, the Wampa continued to haunt me. I could not get that ugly white beast out of my head. I had to have him. Now, I'd like to think that I'm a pretty good and level-headed kid. You know that little kid in the toy store that cries on the floor because he can't get the toy that he wants? That's definitely not me. I wasn't one to throw any tantrums, but I could whine. I didn't whine often, but when it came to the Wampa, boy, did I whine. Dad, please, could I please have a Wampa? Please, please, please. I promise I'll take care of it. He will be my favorite. Please. It didn't happen overnight, but eventually, a few days later, I wore him down and he caved. And I got my Wampa, and he was magnificent. Actually, what he was a hollow toy with very basic articulation. His selling point though was his arms that were attached together by some elastic mechanism inside the body, which allowed you to make him swipe at any unfortunate action figure. He could then drag said figure by the feet or hold him up high over his head. And that was it. But for me, that was just perfect. Anyway, he was my favorite toy for quite some time. But eventually, after about a year or two of overuse, the elastic band inside finally stretched out too much and his arms became useless and would just droop to the side and his white fur started turning yellow. Pretty soon, he found his place at the back of the shelf and was ultimately forgotten. But even though his time was relatively limited, the Wampa kept a special place in my heart, as being one of the only toys I specifically remember whining over. Through the years, Hasbro has released a couple more Wampas with better details and articulation, but none of them came close to the original in my eyes. I was never moved to get any of them. But that changed in 2013 when Hasbro started their new 6-inch Star Wars Black Series line aimed at adult collectors, like me. Anyway, long story short, a year later they announced that they would be releasing the Wampa. And just like that, my resolve was broken. I had resisted before, but a giant, highly articulated and detailed Wampa was just too much. Unfortunately, they decided to package him with a Hoth version of Luke Skywalker, which would basically drive up the overall price. When the 2-pack eventually made its way to retail, I was still hesitant. At this point, I still wasn't what you would call all in on the line. Since I already had Bespin Fatigue's Luke, I didn't care for another Luke in the collection. All I wanted was the Wampa. Then the day finally came. On a random trip to Green Hills, which is Toy Central of Manila, I came over a loose Wampa on display in one store. The price tag was okay, definitely better than the actual retail, but for some reason I still wasn't quite convinced. Anyway, I asked to take a look at it, and when I held him in my hands, all the childhood love I had for this big, white, ugly beast came rushing back, and it was game over. With a smile I couldn't wipe off my face, I eagerly surrendered my money, and the Wampa was mine. The shopkeeper probably noticed my excitement and curiously asked me, "Sino ba yan?" Or, "Who is that anyway?" And I just sheepishly grinned back at her like a little kid and said, "Hoth Wampa." And just like that, the Wampa and I lived happily ever after. So who else out there is a fan of the Wampa? Anyone else want a Wampa? Comment down below and tell me your story. Thanks for watching Stories from the Toy Shelf Redux. If you enjoyed this story, please click on the like button and subscribe to the channel to help me tell more. Until the next one.